Very many people long to communicate with someone from their deceased loved ones. However, such desires rarely come true. Most of the time, the deceased appear to people who don't ask them to. At such moments, a person clearly feels the presence of the deceased. He does not have the slightest doubt that this meeting actually took place. But for what purpose do the dead bother living people? This is the question asked by British journalist and publicist William Stead. William Thomas Stead was born in 1849 in Northumberland County, the son of a clergyman. His father gave him his primary education. At the age of 5, the talented child was fluent in English and Latin and quoted the Holy Scriptures by heart. After school, at the insistence of his parents, he went to study trading, but dreamed of journalism. During the year, he sent his notes to the local newspaper. They were so good that the young man was invited to become the editor-in-chief of the publication. So at the age of 22, William became the head of the small newspaper Northern Echo of Darlington and became the youngest editor-in-chief of Great Britain. Thus began his brilliant career. William Stead is called one of the pioneers of investigative journalism. He was the author of several high-profile articles. In one of his investigations, the reporter claimed that some respectable Londoners, whose names the journalist did not hide, were buying daughters from poor parents. William Stead also had to investigate mystical stories, the witnesses of which claimed that the dead gave them certain worries. The journalist investigated such situations and gave conclusions as to whether these stories were true. I clearly saw how the wall opposite me seemed to dissolve. At the end of September 1891, William Stead received a letter from a priest living in a suburb of London. The author of the letter told the journalist about one amazing incident from his life. The priest often confessed people before his death. One day, he was invited to the home of a parishioner named John. This man had been suffering from chest disease for many years. I confessed to this man and promised to look at him the next day. After leaving the patient, I wanted to walk to my house. The journey took about an hour. I got home just as dusk was beginning to fall outside. After making myself some tea, I sat down in an armchair to read the newspaper. I had no time to open it when suddenly something strange happened. I clearly saw how the wall opposite me seemed to dissolve. The priest reported in his letter to William Stead. Instead of a wall, he saw his parishioner John, who was sitting on his bed and looking at the priest with a pleading look. The latter was not scared, but surprised. For at least 5 seconds, the priest looked at John, and John looked at him. Then the phenomenon gradually began to disappear, and soon the priest saw only a wall in front of him. The next morning, John's wife approached the priest in the church. With tears in her eyes, she announced that her husband had died. It happened half an hour after the priest left. Before his death, he asked for a mass to be celebrated for him. John was dying with the priest's name on his lips. The letter with this story, which William Stead received, concluded with a request. The priest asked the journalist to come and talk to the eyewitnesses of the incident. At the end of the trip, William Stead wrote an article telling the story and supporting it with eyewitness accounts. In his book, Real Ghost Stories, the publicist has collected evidence that confirms the presence of a disembodied human being. For example, a letter from a sailor was published in it. He was talking about an event that happened to his friend, who served with him on the same ship. One day, a sailor saw his friend sad and worried. The cause of the alarm was a dream in which a sailor saw his young son dying of croup. The friend was able to describe some details of this dream. For example, the fact that his child was on a red blanket. Later, this man received confirmation of his dream. His wife, who was in France at the time, informed him in a letter about their son's death. He really died of croup. Later, the sailor learned some details of the incident. His son spent the last moments of his life lying on a red blanket. An old acquaintance of Stead's claimed that her grandfather knocked on the window for several nights after his death, scaring relatives. As it turned out, in this way he demanded to return his beloved smoking pipe, which his son took with him as a souvenir immediately after the funeral. When the phone returned to the apartment, the night visits stopped. And the most amazing thing is that the phone disappeared from the house. The reason for another similar article was the story of the Irish teacher Georgiana. This woman was the wife of a postal official in Dublin, but their marriage was short-lived. Georgiana was soon widowed. After a while, the woman got married again. But this alliance turned out to be extremely unsuccessful. Georgiana's second husband, Irving O'Neill, was a talented engineer with a brilliant mind. However, honesty was not one of the best qualities of this man. Georgiana soon found out that her husband was already married. His first wife lived in London. Georgiana loved her husband, but after learning the news, she decided to run away from him to Italy. Irving found out where his second wife had gone. He followed her. The scenes that took place between them at that time were extremely difficult. The woman he deceived, although she also loved him, had such a strong character that she flatly refused to get back together with him. Irving left, threatening to take her own life. Georgiana felt that something bad was going to happen to her husband. Less than a week later, late in the evening, she saw Irving again at her window. He called her name loudly and then disappeared into the darkness. The dead do not come to fulfill some wish of the living. From that evening on, Irving began to constantly harass Georgiana. One day, when the woman was checking her school notebooks at home, Irving appeared on her doorstep again. He was wearing a coat. Irving was holding his top hat in his hands. He looked at Georgiana with a serious look, but then his face took on a mournful expression. When I saw Irving in my house, I was scared to death. I thought he was going to make a scene for me again. But Irving just stared at me in silence. Then I noticed that the top hat in his hands had disappeared, and then his figure itself began to melt. My insides turned cold with horror. I was afraid to move, and I sat at the table all night. Without taking my eyes off, I looked at the door through which Irving entered, Georgiana told William Stead. The fear receded only when she saw the first glimmer of dawn in the windows of her room. Georgiana was sure that Irving had actually visited her. The woman decided that she only imagined that her guest had disappeared into thin air and attributed it to her fatigue and insomnia. 3 more days have passed. Georgiana was sitting in her room again when suddenly a familiar voice was heard outside her window. It was Irving again. He asked. Georgiana decided to talk to the guest and ask him to stop bothering her. She ran outside, but there was no one there. The woman was sure that Irving was here somewhere, and now he was watching her. He just wants to see if she'll be looking for him. Georgiana went all over the courtyard to find him. But Irving was nowhere to be found. As the days passed, he continued to haunt her. She often heard Irving coughing under her window, as people do when they want to attract attention to themselves. Sometimes he called her by name and asked her to talk to him. It could have gone on all night. Georgiana had no doubt that Irving had settled not far from her house. One day, hearing him under the window, the woman ran out into the street again. There was a thick fog. Georgiana screamed, "Irving, come to me, because I know you're hiding to scare me. I saw you." A few steps away from her, out of the fog, his voice shouted, "Yes, it's me, Irving." Then there was a deep, terrible sigh, and everything went quiet around her. For 9 weeks, Georgiana heard coughing, sighing, and moaning at night. At the end of the 9th week, she received a letter. It reported that Irving died on November 28th. This meant that by the time Irving started harassing Georgiana, he was no longer alive. Georgiana asked William Stead to find out if the letter with the news of Irving's death could be someone's joke. The journalist conducted his research and found out that Irving really died on November 28th. He decided to put an end to his broken life. Georgiana recalled that during their last conversation, Irving had told her that their souls would always be together. He said that she would never see him alive again, but his soul would definitely find Georgiana. After Georgiana found out that Irving was gone, he stopped bothering her. Apparently, the goal that this man set for himself was achieved. These stories, which I have personally spoken to, confirm that the dead do not come to fulfill some wish of the living. They are not much different from us. First of all, they strive to fulfill their last desires, which connect them with earthly life. When they succeed, they disappear from our sight forever, William Stead believed. Many people make a will before their death, but contrary to popular belief, They write not only about the deceased's property, but also about what he asks his relatives to do after his death. The last will of the deceased can also be recorded there. Of course, no one forces you to do it, but if you don't, your soul won't calm down. It happens that relatives neglect their duties to the deceased. Then he cannot find peace because he has not completed some things on earth. To get rid of this, he will come to his relatives and persistently remind them of himself and his last request. Death is a door from one room to another. Stead has collected and published evidence that the existence of a person's personality never ends. William said that a person can anticipate his imminent departure or the demise of people close to him. The life of the publicist himself has become a confirmation of this. William Stead often liked to repeat that he would not die of natural causes. Either the heroes of my revelatory articles will destroy me, or I will drown. The writer's story called Through the Eyes of a Survivor about how a ship sank in the middle of the Atlantic is also called prophetic. It was published a quarter of a century before the sinking of the Titanic. The main character of this story is the sailor Thompson. He's sailing on a mail ship across the Atlantic. During this trip, the sailor comes up with the idea that the number of lifeboats on passenger ships does not match the number of passengers. And in the event of a shipwreck, many of them will not be able to escape. In the story, two ships collide. Passengers of one of them are dying. At the end of his fantastic story, the author summarizes, "This is exactly what can and will happen if liners go to sea with few boats on board." Stead boarded the Titanic as a first-class passenger, bound for America to attend the Congress at the request of the 27th President, William Howard Taft. After the ship collided with an iceberg, he helped put women and children into lifeboats. When all the boats had sailed, Stead went to the smoking room, where he was last seen reading a book in an armchair. If we take this as a fact, then he obviously died, falling into the rift formed between the third and fourth pipes, and that's where the salon is located. His body was never found. As you know, there were not enough boats on the Titanic either. At first, 48 of them were planned, and then this number was reduced to 20. They decided that the boats spoiled the respectable appearance of the ship. The story of the mail steamer was invented, and the main character of the story was saved. In life, everything turned out exactly the opposite. But that's not the end of the story. His most famous book, called The Blue Island. The journalist dictated the experience of life after death, already being in another world. Estelle, the daughter of a publicist, was able to contact her father's spirit 5 years after his death with the help of her friend Pardo Woodman, who mastered the technique of automatic writing. In psychology, this is what is called the ability of a person in a trance state to write texts without controlling this process. According to researchers, such writing gives access to the unconscious. That's what Estelle remembers. Woodman did not know my father personally and was not familiar with his work, and yet the wording and phrases in the messages indicated my father's authorship, and even the manner of writing was typical of him. Pardo writes with his eyes closed, often covering them with a handkerchief. Some of the best messages were recorded in semi-darkness when I couldn't watch the process, but the words were never written on top of the others. We've had a lot of similar sessions. The messages received from my father contain clear evidence of his continued existence. What is said in these messages? For example, they contain descriptions of the events that happened to William Stead immediately after his death. First, he, along with other souls, watched as the Titanic disappeared under the water, and then all the dead set off, taking off over the night ocean. Soon, they found themselves at a place called the Blue Island. William's father, who had died much earlier, was waiting for him here. Stead noted that his father looked much younger at the time of the meeting than he did at the end of his earthly life. Now they looked not like father and son, but like two brothers. It is obvious that the afterlife on the island takes place in an atmosphere of love and joy. Here's what the journalist himself says about her. I left earthly life a few years ago, and even though all this time my connection with earthly life and with those who are dear to me has not been interrupted, I still would not like to go back. Personally, I was very impressed by this story, and you? Write your opinion about her in the comments. Dear friends, thank you for watching my video to the end. If you liked it, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's very important. Thank you, and have a nice day.